The footage opens on a black screen. A single sound. A door closing. Not slamming closing. The specific, considered click of a lock, turned by someone who has already decided. Then, blinding West Texas daylight. A woman walking away from a compound gate, canvas duffel swinging at her hip, not looking back. Her spine is straight. Her jaw is set. The camera catches her from behind, and she is already small against the flat, enormous sky. Voiceover low, measured, not rushed. Her own father arranged it. Her exile wasn't punishment. It was a transaction. Cut to a clean, spare office. A manila envelope sliding across a table. A woman's manicured hand, efficient and cold, resting on top of it. The camera holds on the envelope, doesn't open it. Then a wall of documents, surveillance photos, redacted reports, a lease agreement pinned like a case file. A face circled in one photograph. The same woman from the desert road. Voiceover. Someone had been watching her for 11 years, paying her rent, tracking her movements, before she ever knew his name. Cut to a man. Tall, composed, standing at the edge of a vast desert plain at dusk. The frame is wide. He is as small as she was, dwarfed by the same enormous sky. He is watching the lights on the horizon, the famous Marfa light. Inexplicable, sourceless, real. His face, when the camera finally finds it, is not cold. That is the worst part of it. He looks like a man who believes, entirely, that what he did was love. Voiceover. He was a royal heir. She was collateral. And somewhere between surveillance and obsession, he convinced himself there was a difference. Cut to the woman again, alone in a small, sunlit room. A sketch on her windowsill, an architectural drawing of a building, a note in handwriting she clearly recognizes. She looks at it for a long time. Doesn't move. The camera holds. Voiceover. She found out the truth. She walked away. And then he sent her one last thing. Hard cut to black. The question isn't whether she forgives him. The question is what she does next. The Chihuahuan desert does not care about your reason. It receives you, indifferent as mathematics. And what you bring into it, grief, fury, the particular shame of being expelled from a place that was supposed to be home, it does not absorb. It simply surrounds. The alkaline flats go on in every direction, and the sky sits on top of everything like. And whatever you carry into all that silence, you carry alone. Soledad Vásquez carried a canvas duffel bag, $22 in cash, and the memory of her father's expression when he handed her the bag, not angry, not grief-stricken, not even relieved, neutral. The face of a man completing a task he had scheduled in advance. She had looked for something in that face for as long as she dared, a flinch, a softening, any signal that the expulsion cost him something, and she had found nothing. She stopped looking before she reached the gate. She did not look back once she passed through it. That was on a Tuesday in October, when the creosote smell of coming rain hung over the compound and the cattle in the eastern pasture stood very still, as though they, too, were waiting for something to shift. Soledad walked the Kalish road for a quarter-mile before a voice in some reasonable part of her mind suggested she should probably stop walking aimlessly. She stopped. She put the duffel down. She looked at the sky, which offered no useful information, and then she looked at the road, which stretched in two directions with equal conviction. That was when she noticed the SUV. It was parked at the edge of the road in the direction she hadn't come from, a black vehicle. Government idling with the quiet patience of something that had been waiting a long time and had budgeted for more. The windows were tinted past the legal limit. Soledad stood very still and watched it, the way you watch something in the desert when you're not sure if it's a threat. She had grown up among men who used vehicles as instruments of intimidation, so she knew the grammar of it, the deliberate visibility, the refusal to move, the implication of surveillance without the declaration. She assumed it was one of her father's people. Ensuring she completed the transaction, walking all the way off the Vásquez land and into the dried open Noah of the public road, where she would officially become someone else's problem, she picked up the duffel. She walked in the opposite direction and did not look back. Behind her, the SUV idled on. Then, at some point in the next mile, she became aware that it was no longer there. She didn't hear it leave. It was simply gone. She thought about that for years, without knowing what to make of it. She had a cousin in Alpine, 40 miles east. The cousin Petra, whom the family had always treated as a peripheral embarrassment on account of her divorce and her vegetable garden and her refusal to participate in what Petra called the theater of Vásquez family loyalty, took Soledad in without questions and with the specific practicality of a woman who has survived her own version of the same story. Petra gave her a cot, a shelf in the bathroom, and 2 weeks to figure out her next move. Soledad took 10 days. She arrived in Marfa on a Wednesday morning in a truck borrowed from Petra's neighbor, with a duffel and a second-hand backpack and a list of 3 addresses where rooms might be available. The town received her with the peculiar energy it always exerted on arrivals, a place that was simultaneously too small to be taken seriously and too strange to be dismissed. Population 1,800, 1 stoplight. A Prada boutique in the middle of the desert that sold nothing and was never intended to sell anything. A piece of permanent art installation that locals had long since stopped finding unusual. An arts community transplanted from larger cities, pressing up against fourth-generation ranch families who had been here since before anyone cared about art. The Marfa lights, which appeared at the horizon east of town on clear nights and which had been witnessed, documented, and argued about for over a century without resolution. Soledad was not interested in the art world, the ranch families, or the lights. She was interested in the room above the ceramic studio on Highland Avenue, which was small and south-facing and cost $430 a month, which was within range if she worked every shift available. She was interested in the early morning opening shift at the Flats Diner, 2 blocks away, where the manager, a compact, irritable woman named Gloria, who was irritable in the productive rather than cruel variety, needed someone who could be there at 5 and not call out. She was not interested in being known. She built invisibility the way you'd build a structure in a climate that tested everything, carefully, with attention to where the pressure would come from. She gave people enough for name, a quick biography that was technically accurate, a smile she'd learned to produce independently of what she was actually feeling, and nothing more. The diner regulars respected this without knowing they were respecting it. The ceramic studio owner downstairs, a retired landscape architect from Santa Fe named Vance, acknowledged her existence with the generous discretion of a man who had also, at some point in his life, needed not to be. She worked, she slept, she watched the lights. She found them legitimately comforting in a way she couldn't fully articulate, and didn't try to. They appeared small, pale, wandering orbs at the horizon, and then they were gone, and then they appeared again. And no one had ever offered an explanation that held up to scrutiny. Ball lightning, car headlights, on the distant highway, atmospheric refraction, the restless dead, the theories accumulated without ever settling into fact. What Soledad found consoling was not the mystery itself, but the fact of the mysteries. Things could exist, she decided, without needing to be explained. Causes did not always produce coherent effects. Sometimes you could simply be there, witness, real, continuing, and that would have to be enough. She thought about her mother sometime, in the way you think about something that hurts specifically enough to be instructive. Her mother Cardad, who had watched from the kitchen window as Aurelio handed Soledad the bag, and who had not come outside. Soledad had not expected her to come out. What she had expected, and this expectation embarrassed her now. The way childhood embarrassments always embarrassed her was some kind of message afterward. A letter? A call from a borrowed phone? Something in Petra's mailbox that she could pretend she wasn't waiting. But Petra's mailbox remained neutral. And after enough neutral mornings, Soledad stopped pretending. Whatever her mother had chosen to feel about the expulsion, she had chosen to feel it privately. Inside the compound walls, in the alkaline silence of a life Soledad no longer had access to, she kept the duffel bag in the bottom of the closet and didn't look at it. Sr.ElenaVoss arrived in Marfa on a Thursday in March, 6 months after Soledad, with the deliberate unobtrusiveness of a man who had thought carefully about the staging. He came in a rented pickup truck rather than a car service. He wore broken-in jeans and a plain button-down rather than anything that read as money. His security detail, all of whom had worked with him long enough to have internalized the operational texture of his preferences, arrived separately, distributed themselves across 2 rental properties and the only Badan breakfast in town, and proceeded to behave like the architects, photographers, and journalists they were each tasked with resembling. He had done this kind of approach before, in other contexts, for other purposes. He was not improvising. But he had never done it for this particular, and the distinction was not lost on him as he drove into Marfa in the pale morning, past the Prada installation that watched the highway with its vacant display window eyes, past the cattle grid and the feed store and the first intersection, toward the address he had memorized 8 months ago when the final decision was made. He had argued against the approach, internally and with Rosalind, for longer than he should have needed to argue. He had used the word compromise, meaning the compromise of his integrity, the compromised nature of any relationship that began with surveillance, and Rosalind, who had never found a bureaucratic abstraction she couldn't weaponize, had agreed that yes, the situation was morally complex, and had then produced a 17-point risk assessment demonstrating why his physical presence in Marfa was nonetheless strategically essential. He had sat with the risk assessment in his office in Aldenmere for a week. Then he had gotten on a plane. The adobe building on Highland Avenue was not a pretense, exactly. The restoration project was real. The structure genuinely needed work, had been sitting half derelict for 3 years, and the proposal his firm had developed for its revival was architecturally sound and had nothing false about it. This was how Emmerich preferred to work when work of this nature was required. The cover story should not be a lie. It should be a version of the truth arranged to foreground something other than the actual reason. Rosalind called it strategic framing. Emmerich, when he was being honest with himself, which was not always but more often than people who knew him would have assumed, called it the expensive habit of telling yourself you're not deceiving someone when you are choosing, very carefully, what they will and will not know. He saw Soledad for the first time, in person, not in a photograph, not in a surveillance report, on his 4th morning in Marfa. In the Flats diner at 6:17 a.m., he ordered coffee and eggs. She brought the coffee without being asked for it, assessed his order with the flat efficiency of someone who had calibrated her labor precisely to the information required, and walked away. He watched her move through the diner with the attention he gave to structures he was trying to understand, looking for the load-bearing elements, the places where weight was being carried invisibly. She moved like someone who had chosen economy as a form of armor. No unnecessary motion, no performance, he thought. She is doing exactly what I would do. Then he thought, that is either a very good sign or a very bad one. He drank the coffee, which was burnt and therefore excellent in the way that burnt diner coffee always was, honest about what it was, and he paid and tipped without making eye contact. And he walked back to the adobe building on Highland and spent 3 hours reviewing structural drawings and not thinking about Soledad Vásquez. The second time he saw her was at the gas station on the edge of town, 2 days later. She was filling her truck, Petra's cousin's truck, though he didn't know that, and the wind was doing what the Marfa wind did in March, which was everything at once, and her hair was across her face, and she was squinting against it with an expression of patient contempt that he found unreasonably very funny. He did not laugh. He got his gas. She didn't look at him. The third time, the time that became their first actual meeting, or what she understood as a first meeting, though he understood it as something more calibrated, was the broken-down truck on Route 67. 2 weeks after his arrival, the truck breaking down was not engineered. That part was genuinely accidental. A hose that his security lead had identified as a maintenance risk, but that Emmerich had told him to leave alone, because a real breakdown would serve the purpose better than a simulated one, and because engineering an accident felt like a step he was not willing to take. The breakdown happened. He pulled to the shoulder. He got out of the truck. And Soledad, who had been behind him on Route 67 for the past 3 miles on her way back from an early morning supply run, stopped. Because that was what people did out here. You stopped. You know what you're doing. Not unkindly. The specific pragmatism of someone asking a binary question. I know what the problem is, he said. I don't have what I need to fix. She looked at the truck the way you look at a problem you've seen. She had the spare hose. She carried a kit because Petra's cousin's truck was old and because Soledad had learned, early and painfully, that the best way to avoid needing anyone was to carry the tools yourself. She fixed it in 40 minutes. He handed her his phone at one point when she needed a light, and she took it without comment, used it, handed it back. Her hands were precise. She didn't explain what she was doing, and he didn't ask. When she was done, she wiped her hands on a shop rag from the kit and said, "You're the one doing the building on Highland." It wasn't a question. The town was small enough that the restoration project had been noted, discussed, opined upon. "That's me," he said. "It's a good building," she said. And then she got back in her truck and drove away. He stood on the shoulder of Route 67 in the morning light and watched the truck get small on the road ahead. Behind him, the desert went on in all directions, flat and pale and enormous. He thought, "I should leave. This is already more complicated than it should be. I have done the surveillance for 11 years without meeting her, and I should continue doing it from a distance. And I should not be standing here watching the tail lights of her truck disappear and feeling something in my chest that I am not going to name." He thought all of this with great clarity and precision. He came back to the diner the next morning. What built between them over the following weeks was not romantic in any straightforward sense. It was more atmospheric. The way a desert storm builds, pressure accumulating in the air before any visible change in the sky. He came to the diner most mornings. She poured his coffee without asking. They spoke in the short, functional sentences of people who respected each other's economy of language. He learned that she had opinions about the restoration project, specific, structural opinions that she offered once and did not repeat, as though she had made them available and it was now his choice what to do with them, and he took them seriously because they were correct. She noticed that he took them seriously. She recalibrated something, incrementally, in the way she held herself when he came in. He learned her name. She had told Vance at the studio, and Vance mentioned it in passing. And Emmerich heard it as though hearing it for the first time. Even though he had known it for 11 years. Even though it was the first word he'd said the morning his oversight of her life had begun. Even though it was the name he'd run through risk assessments and medical invoices and property searches for over a decade. He heard her say it once to a customer on the phone, "Soledad, yeah." From the diner, and the casualness of the way she offered it so plain, as though it were simply a sound attached to her rather than the word around which his entire professional moral crisis had organized itself, did something to him that he filed under. "Do not examine this." He examined it anyway. Late at night, in the rented house where he slept badly and watched the lights at the horizon through the window, and thought about what he was doing here, what he believed he was entitled to. What line between protection and possession? He had been walking for 11 years, and whether he had ever been on the right side of it. He had a great deal of money, and a title that people attached great symbolic weight to, and an education that had trained him to solve problems through institutional mechanisms. None of these resources were useful to the question that kept finding him in the desert dark. Was what he felt for Soledad Vásquez a consequence of having watched over her, a proprietary emotion masquerading as care? Or had it become something else? Something independent of its origins, something that would have found him regardless of how it started. He did not know. He stayed in Marfa. There is a particular quality to the silence in Marfa at 2 in the morning, different from the silence of the desert outside it, thicker, somehow, compressed by the small adobe walls on either side of the street, by the few lit windows of people awake at hours that belonged to insomnia and grief. Soledad had come to know this silence, the way you come to know a neighbor whose habits you understand without being friends. By proximity, by repetition, by the specific loneliness of being awake when most people weren't. She couldn't sleep on the nights when she thought about her father. Not grief, she had cleared that debt months ago, or told herself she had, but the specific irritation of a logic she couldn't resolve. The cattle, the land, the compound, with its caliche road and its alkaline silence and its elaborate systems of loyalty that functioned like architecture. Hold this shape, distribute the weight this way. Do not ask what the structure is actually. She had grown up inside those walls believing that the purpose was family. She had been 22 years old when the purpose turned out to be something else. Something she wasn't given the words for. Something sealed with a canvas duffel bag and a flat, neutral face, and the click of a gate latch. She sat on the roof of Vance's studio on these nights. where there was an old lawn chair and a view east toward the plain, and she watched the lights. They were there more often than the tourist literature suggested, 3 or 4 nights a week, if the sky was clear. Pale orbs tracking lateral paths across the darkness, occasionally splitting into two, occasionally disappearing mid-movement and reappearing yards away. Soledad had read everything written about them, which was considerable: the geological, the atmospheric physics papers, the indigenous accounts that predated European settlement, the contemporary academic arguments that were really just arguments about methodology dressed up as arguments about lights. No one agreed. Everyone was certain. She found the certainty more interesting than the lights themselves. Emmerich found her up there one night, in late April, which she hadn't expected. He had never been to the studio, and she had not told him she came up to the roof. He appeared at the top of the exterior staircase looking slightly wrong-footed in a way she hadn't seen from him before, as though he had followed an impulse and was now performing calculations about whether the impulse had been wise. "Vance said you were up here," he offered. Soledad considered this. "You talked to Vance." "I was walking past. He was outside. He mentioned you." A pause. "I was walking past quite slowly." She did not smile, but she moved the box of spare kill tiles off the other lawn chair, and he took this as the invitation it was. He sat. They both looked east at the lights, which were performing their usual uncommitted drift across the horizon. For a long time, neither of them spoke. This was the nature of it. Between them, the conversation that happened in the absence, conducted in posture and proximity, and the careful decisions about how much space to take up. Soledad was aware that she had allowed this person closer than she had intended, and she was aware that this was her own doing, not coercion, not manipulation that she could name, simply the accumulated evidence of someone who listened without agenda, who did not flinch from her silences, who had opinions about restoration and kept them honest. She was also aware, in the way you're aware of something peripheral and significant, that she did not know very much about him, and that this knowledge gap, which she had maintained deliberately in other relationships as a form of self-protection, felt different here, less like a boundary she was holding and more like a hole. "You know what they're not?" he said eventually. "About the lights? Tell me." "Car headlights. The geometry is wrong. They move in directions that a highway doesn't allow for, and ball lightning is usually associated with storm conditions. These appear on clear nights." "I know," she said. "I've read the debunking paper." And she thought about it. They explain what the lights aren't. They don't explain what they are. Which I think is different from saying the lights don't exist. She paused. A lot of people confuse those two things. He was quiet for a moment. "That's true of more than lights." She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon with the territorial focus she had noticed the first morning in the diner, that quality of looking at something as though it already had his name on it. But there was something else in it tonight that she hadn't seen before, or hadn't allowed herself to see. Something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. She filed it and didn't pursue. Not yet. The morning in late May when she poured scalding water on her own hand was the result of a customer who changed his order 3 times and then disputed the check. It was a minor burn. She'd done worse with kill equipment, but her grip went unstable and the water hit the heel of her palm, and she made a sound that was not loud enough to be a cry, but loud enough for Emmerich, who was at the counter, to be on his feet before she'd finished making it. He was beside her in the kitchen doorway, and his hand was around her wrist. Not gripping, just containing, steady. The way you hold something fragile, not to constrain it, but to stop it from shaking apart. And he said, "Cold water, now. Keep it running." She did. He held her wrists under the tap for 4 minutes without letting go, not talking, just making sure the water was cold enough and that she was standing up. When it was done, he stepped back. She looked at him. Something had shifted in the air between them, with the specific finality of a temperature change. "You've done that before." "That's steady." "My sister," he said. "When we were young, she had a lab in the basement of our house. Science experiment." Soledad dried her hand carefully. "Your sister do science experiments in basements." "She did everything in basements. She found them efficient." He said it with a flatness that contained, somewhere behind it, something very old and not fully resolved. She hasn't changed. This was the most personal thing he'd said to her in 6 weeks. Soledad understood it as the opening of a door left ajar. Not an invitation inside, but the possibility of one. She thought about asking. She decided to wait. She waited, it turned out, until the night of the dust storm. They came without much warning. In spring, the big ones, haboobs, that turned the air the color of rust and reduced visibility to a matter of feet and filled your teeth with grit for 3 days. The radio gave an hour's notice and most people used it. Soledad didn't. She was on the roof when it hit. She'd been stubborn about the approach. Watching it come across the plain in a great brown wall that was objectively beautiful in the way that only things that can destroy you are, buff. And by the time the first full gusts reached Highland Avenue, she was sitting with her back against the studio's parapet, eyes open, watching the storm swallow the lights at the horizon one by one. Emmerich found her there because of course he did. Because he had by this point developed a kind of navigational instinct for where Soledad would be when a reasonable person would be indoors. Not a psychic sense, but an operational one. Built on weeks of observing where she went when she was thinking hard about something. He climbed the stairs and found her sitting in the rust-colored dark. Grit in her eyelashes, expression as unreadable as the sky. He sat down next to her without speaking, which was the right choice. And they stayed there for 40 minutes while the storm moved through, shouldering into them with systematic rudeness, stripping the air down to its molecular components. He was aware, at a level below the level of manageable thought, of how much he didn't deserve to be sitting here, of the 11 years folded into this moment, of the fact that the files in Rosalind's office contained a photograph of this woman taken 18 months after her exile from the compound, on a roof in Alpine, sitting alone in almost exactly this posture, and that the photograph had been taken without her knowledge, and had been reviewed by him. And that he had told himself at the time that the review was professional. He had believed it, more or less. He wasn't sure he believed it. Eventually she said, "You're staying?" "Yes, not just for the building." A pause. "No." She absorbed this. The storm moved through them. "I don't know what to do with that." "I know. I'm not asking you to know." She thought about her father's face, neutral at the gate. She thought about the 11 years in which she had rebuilt herself from a woman who had been handed over to a woman who belonged to herself. She thought about the lights at the horizon, which the storm had swallowed, which would come back. "Tell me something true," she said. Emmerich looked at her in the rust dark and thought about all the truth, and how each of them was incomplete, and how the incompleteness was the lie he had been living inside for 6 months. "I came to Marfa because I needed to be somewhere that wasn't what I'm supposed to be," he said. "It was true. It was not enough. And I stayed because of you." That was true too. And it was also not enough. And he knew it. And he sat with the knowledge the way you sit with a structure you've undermined, waiting for the moment it fails. She looked at him for a long time in the dark. Then she nodded, once, and they sat together until the storm passed. The thing about a structure that has been undermined is that it holds, sometimes, for longer than it should. It holds because the people inside it are not yet pushing on the right wall. Soledad Vásquez was not a person who pushed walls at random. She was precise, economical, patient, she had learned, in the way that people who've been hurt by institutions learn, to wait for the system to reveal itself before she acted again. The system revealed itself on a Tuesday in June, which was, perhaps appropriately, also the kind of day that smelled of coming rain. She was in the studio when the woman arrived. Not in the diner. She'd switched to afternoons by then, working with Vance on a series of plates he was finishing for a gallery in Houston. Learning the wheel by default, because Vance had the habit of teaching by proximity. Leaving her at the wheel and talking from across the room as though the lesson were only incidentally connected to her. She was good at it. Her hands had the patience for the clay that her father's compound had tried to root into cattle management, and that had had nowhere useful to go until now. The woman who came into the studio was not a pottery customer. You could tell this immediately, not from her clothes, which were understated in the particular way of people whose wealth doesn't require statement, but from the way she held the space when she entered it. Efficient, proprietary. The walk of someone who had determined in advance exactly where they intended to stand. She was perhaps 45, with the bone structure of someone who had been striking for so long it had become a posture rather than a feature. Her hair was cut with the severity of a design decision. She set a manila envelope on the table between them and sat down across from Soledad with the ease of a woman who set manila envelopes on tables regularly and found the process unremarkable. "My name is Sr.ElenaVoss," she said. "I think you deserve to know certain things, and I think you deserve to know them from someone other than my brother." The name Voss. Soledad's hands went still in the cloth. She did not remove them yet. She looked at the woman across the table and performed the calculation she always performed when something dangerous arrived. How much to reveal? How much to withhold? How to hold the room without making it a confrontation before she knew what she was confronting? "Your brother." Neutral. Informational. Emmerich. Yes. Rosalind's eyes were light gray, precise as instruments. Opened the envelope. Soledad looked at the envelope. She thought about what Emmerich had said in the dust storm. "I stayed because of you," and about the guilt she had seen in his face on the roof in April, and about the systematic quality of his presence in Marfa that had never fully read to her as accidental, even when she told herself it was. She thought about the SUV at the edge of the Kalish Road, 11 months ago, idling in the flat October light. She opened the envelope. The documents came out in order, which she understood was intentional. Sr.ElenaVoss was a woman who ordered things. First, what appeared to be surveillance reports, organized chronologically, with dates that began 11 years ago and addresses she recognized: Alpine. Then the brief months in El Paso. Then Marfa. Photographs, her face in various places, at various ages, with the flat two-dimensional quality of images taken without the subject's knowledge of the camera. Second, medical invoices marked paid in full through a holding company she'd never heard of. For the knee surgery 2 years ago that she'd assumed she'd gotten through a grant program the clinic had described vaguely as community partnership. Third, a lease agreement for the room on Highland Avenue, the signature on the tenant's line hers. But the guarantor, she turned the page over and read the entity name twice to make sure a shell company registered in Luxembourg. She set these aside. At the center of the pile was a single document, 8 pages, with a header in both English and French. The English read, "Royal Protection Charter, executed between the House of Vasaldinmir and Aurelio Vásquez et al." The date was 11 years ago, 2 weeks after the canvas duffel bag, 2 weeks after the flat, neutral face, 2 weeks after the click of the gate. She read it entirely. Then she put it down on the table and put her hands flat on the cladested surface and looked at the far wall of the studio where Vance's tools hung on their pegs in careful order. Each in its place, each doing the job its shape suggested. "He knew my name before I told it to him." Rosalind said nothing. "He was already in Marfa. He was already here before Route 67. Yes, he chose to be here. He chose the building." A pause. "He chose all of it." Rosalind set her hand, folded, on the table. She had the face of a woman who had prepared for this conversation and was not enjoying it with the ease she'd expected. "I came here because I thought it was the right thing to do. I am aware that may not be a sufficient justification." "No," said Soledad, "it isn't." She stood up. She put the documents back into the envelope. She held the envelope for a moment and then set it back down on the table. Because taking it felt like accepting something she wasn't ready to accept, and leaving it felt like refusing to know what she now knew. And there was no clean option, which was the specific quality of certain truth. They did not offer you a posture that was both honest and comfortable. "Get out!" Rosalind stood. She was neither flustered nor satisfied. She had the expression of someone performing a moral duty that costs something. "I'm sorry. For what it's worth." "It isn't worth very much right now," said Soledad. "That may change. I don't know yet." Rosalind left. Soledad stood alone in the studio with the envelope and the clay and the afternoon light coming through the south window, and the particular silence of a room that has just held something that changed the shape of everything inside. She looked at the envelope. She picked it up. She put it in the cabinet under the wheel and closed the cabinet door. Then she sat back down at the wheel and put her hands in the clay and started over. She waited 3 days before she went to find. Not because she wasn't ready. She was in the cold. architectural way in which Soledad Vásquez was always ready for difficult things. Having been trained by circumstance to treat hardship as a material to be worked rather than a condition to be endured, but because she wanted to be certain of the specific shape of what she was going to say, she was not the kind of person who went into confrontations unprepared. Her father had taught her that, at least, even if he'd taught her nothing else worth keeping, she thought about what she knew and what it meant. The charter was a legal instrument, executed between two parties, neither of whom was her. Her name appeared in it as the subject of protection rather than as a signatory, which meant she had never consented to anything it described. Aurelio Vasquez had signed it as her father and as the party to the arrangement, which had the specific quality of a man who believed that his ownership of his daughter's life was extensive enough to be contractually licensed. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about her mother in the kitchen window, not coming outside. She wondered if her mother had known, and concluded, with a clarity that was not comforting, that Soledad had not, that the charter was the kind of arrangement that a man of Aurelio Vasquez's particular variety of pride would have made alone, because sharing it would have required admitting what it was. She thought about Emmerich. She thought about the roof in April, the dust storm in May, every diner morning, every careful sentence, every silence that she had taken for restraint, and that had been something more complicated. She thought about his face when she'd asked, "How would you know?" After he'd said, "Some families protect their image more than their children." She thought about the thing she'd seen behind his eyes when she gave him her name. On Route 67, not recognition in any social sense, but recognition in a deeper sense. The recognition of something you have been carrying so long you have learned its weight. She thought about whether she loved him. She sat with this question on the roof for 2 of the 3 days, watching the lights, which declined to offer anything new. On the 3rd morning she got up, put on her boots, and walked to the adobe building on Highland Avenue. The restoration was nearly complete. The building had been transformed over the months into something that justified its own existence. The original 1920s bones were intact. The limestone and adobe walls cleaned and repointed, new windows cut with careful deference to the proportions of the old ones. The courtyard in the center had been paved with reclaimed brick. Someone had planted something in the corner that hadn't bloomed yet but showed the intention of blooming. Standing in the courtyard that morning, Soledad thought, "This is what someone does when they want to make something last." Whatever else was true of Emmerich Voss, he did his work honestly. She found him in the back room going over the final snagging list with the site foreman. He looked up when she came in, and his expression went through 3 things in rapid succession: apprehension, something that was trying very hard not to be hope, and then settled into a stillness that was the most honest thing she'd seen from him yet. Because it didn't perform anything. It just waited. "Come outside." He came outside. They walked without destination, which was the only way to walk in Marfa, without it seeming like a performance, just moving. Through the streets and out the eastern edge of town, onto the flat plain where the gravel road gave out and the dark took over and the lights were visible in their full, uncommitted strangeness at the horizon. They walked until the town behind them was a small cluster of lit windows and the sky above them was full of stars with a specific generosity of skies that have no competing light to contend with. Soledad stopped walking. She turned to face him. "Tell me when it started," she said. "The real starting point? Not Route 67. Emmerich had spent 3 days of his own with this question, knowing it was coming, preparing and discarding preparation. In the end, he chose the thing he'd never chosen before in any professional or personal context, which was the unstructured truth offered without framing. 11 years ago, he said, there was a risk assessment conducted on assets connected to the consortium your father worked with. Your father was identified as a potential exposure. The charter was the proposed solution. I was asked to review it." A pause. I had been in the role for 3 years. "I approved." "You approved it?" "Yes." She absorbed this. The wind moved through the dry grass around them. And the oversight, 11 years of watching where I lived and what I did and paying for things I thought I'd earned through community programs. I oversaw it. He didn't look away. The reports came to me quarterly. I read them. I told myself it was professional obligation. Protection. That the charter committed us to your welfare, and I was honoring the commitment? But you were reading them. Yes. For 11 years? Yes. The word had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not shame performed for her benefit, but shame metabolized, lived with, recognized, without resolution. I told myself a great many things about the distinction between surveillance and oversight. I'm not sure the distinction held. Soledad looked at the lights at the horizon. A pale cluster of 3, moving in their lateral drift across the dark. When did it become something else? Besides professional? A long silence. 3 years after the charter was executed, there was a quarterly report that mentioned you had started taking classes ceramics at a community center in El Paso. It was a two-line notation. I don't know why I thought about it as long as I did. He paused. I told myself it was relevant to the welfare assessment, that taking up a skill was a positive indicator. I filed it that way. But you kept thinking about it. I kept thinking about it. Another pause. That's when I understood that the professional framing was no longer accurate, and that I had 2 choices: transferred the oversight to someone else, which was the correct institutional choice, or, he stopped. Or what? Or stay close to it myself. He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was the kind that has been held in for so long it has become structural. I told myself staying close was better, more careful, less risk of institutional mishandling. He paused. That was a lie, I told myself. The real reason was that I wasn't ready to give up the quarterly reports. And that should have told me everything. Soledad was quiet for a long time. The lights moved. The wind pressed against them from the south. You came to Marfa? She said. Yes. To be near me? To yes. And 2, I told myself that I wanted to know if what I felt was real. If it was something that could exist outside the context of the files and the obligation. If meeting you, actually meeting you, without the apparatus would make it smaller or larger. And larger, he said quietly, substantially. She turned to face him fully then. Sr.ElenaVoss stood in the dark of the Chihuahuan desert with his hands at his sides and his face open in a way she had not seen from anyone in a very long time. And she thought, he is not performing this, which was the worst part. A performance would have been easier to refuse. Here's what I think, she said. Voice was even. She had the desert in it, that quality of saying exactly what it meant, and no more. I think you believed, every step of the way, that what you were doing was care. I think you are a man who is very good at reframing his choices in terms of what he's protecting. And I think you have done it for so long that you can no longer always tell the difference between protection and control. She paused. My father was that man. He told himself everything he did was for the family. The cattle, the compound, the alliances, the arrangements he made about people in his care without their knowledge. It was all framed as protection. She looked at him steadily. I am not saying you are the same as him. I am saying you are in the same category of mistake. Emmerich said nothing. He listened with his whole body, the way someone listens to a structural assessment when they know the assessment is accurate. You chose Marfa because I was here. You designed the first meeting. You were reading about my life for 8 years before you ever stood 6 feet away from me. And then you came to my roof. You sat with me in the dust storm. You stopped. Something crossed her face that was not anger. It was more costly than anger. You made me trust you. Without giving me the information I needed to decide whether trusting you was something I actually chose, or something I was maneuvered into. I know, he said. You're right. I know I'm right. She looked at the lights. The thing is, and this is the part I've been sitting with for 3 days, I don't think you were lying to me. I think you genuinely don't know the difference between what you intended and what it actually caught. Which is, in some ways, more of a problem than if you'd been deliberately cruel. Cruelty, I know how to refute. Good intentions with bad architecture are harder. Emmerich looked at her, this woman who had been handed to him as an obligation and had become entirely against the logic of the situation, the most honest mirror he had ever stood in front of, and he felt something give way in his chest that had been held in place for a very long time. Not release. More like the acknowledgement of a structure that had already failed, finally being named. I came here, he said carefully, because I wanted to know if I could be someone you chose. not someone you were given. He stopped. I have understood. Since Rosalind went to see you, since before that, if I'm being honest, that I robbed you of the preconditions for that choice. That everything between us exists on a foundation you didn't know about and didn't agree to. He paused. I don't have a solution. I don't have an institutional mechanism for this. I have only, he exhaled. And it was a sound that contained everything the desert contained. Distance and honesty and the specific loneliness of knowing exactly what you did wrong and being unable to undo it. The knowledge that what I feel is real and that it doesn't entitle me to anything. She heard this. She stood with it in the dark. The way she stood with the lights, neither explaining them away nor accepting them entirely, just holding the reality of them. You never gave me the chance to choose. You chose for me before I knew you existed. And then she walked back into Marfa alone. He stood at the edge of the plain for a long time after she left. The lights pulsed at the horizon, steady, sourceless, real. Behind him, the town was a cluster of warm windows in the dark. He thought about his sister, who had prepared a 17-point risk assessment and sent him into the desert and had not, he now understood, actually anticipated this outcome, not this particular flavor of it. Rosalind believed in instruments and mechanisms, and the clean resolution of. She had not anticipated that the system she'd built over 11 years would resolve into a woman standing in the desert, accurate as the night, and that the resolution would cost exactly what it cost. He left Marfa the following week. The restoration project was complete. There was nothing professionally legitimate to hold him. He left without another conversation with Soledad. He did not go to the diner, did not appear on the roof, did not leave a message through Vance. He had spent enough of his life managing other people's experience of him, through strategic framing. The least he could do now was to leave cleanly, without the architecture of an arranged exit. He drove out on Route 67, past the place where the truck had broken down in March, past the wide flat plain, and the distant mountains, and the enormous sky that continued regardless. His security detail followed at a distance. The Marfa lights were visible in the east even in the daytime. Or rather, the absence of them was visible. The flat horizon that would hold them again tonight and the next night and the night after, whether anyone was watching or not. Which Soledad had read and acknowledged and declined a local attorney named Carmen Reyes, who specialized in estate and contract law and who had the practical directness of someone who believed that legal instruments, however elaborately constructed, were ultimately just words that other words could undo. This is unusual, Carmen said, going through the charter on the first meeting. I know, said Soledad. It's not uninfallible. It was executed by one party and wasn't signed by you. The consent issue alone. How long? Soledad asked. Carmen looked at the documents. 3 months? Maybe 4? Fine, said Soledad, and paid the retainer with money she had earned at the Flats diner. The 3 months that followed had the quality of the desert itself, long and flat and clarifying, offering no shelter from what needed to be faced. She told Vance the broad outlines one evening when they were closing up the studio. He listened without surprise, which suggested to her that Vance was a man who had witnessed enough human complexity that a European royal surveillance arrangement in a small Texas art town barely registered as unusual. He nodded and said, You want to buy in? And she said, Buy in to what? And he said, The studio. Half. I've been thinking about it for a while. I'm not as young as this town sometimes requires. She took 3 days to think about it and then said yes. Carmen drew up the paperwork. She called her mother once, on a Sunday afternoon when the light was coming through the south window at the angle. That made the studio look like a painting of itself. Caridad answered on the second ring, which told Soledad that the number had been saved. The conversation was short and operated entirely in the subtext of 2 women who had both learned silence as a first language. Her mother asked if she was eating. She said yes. She asked how Caridad was. Fine, fine. And the cattle were fine and the rains had been better. A pause that lasted too long and was full of everything that the pause contained. Then, your father is the same. Not an explanation, not an apology, but offered with a texture that Soledad understood as the closest Caridad could come to both. She said, I know. She said, I'm okay. She said goodbye. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long time afterward. Then she put it down and went back to the wheel. The charter was declared void on a Wednesday in September. In a document that Carmen emailed to her at 9:14 in the morning with the subject line "Done," Soledad read it twice at the diner counter before her shift. Between the first and second coffees, it cited 3 legal grounds, the cleanest of which was the consent provision. No party to a protection arrangement could be bound without knowledge and agreement, regardless of the relationship between the signing parties. Aurelio Vásquez's authority over his daughter had not extended to the license of her freedom, even by the standards of the document's own jurisdiction. She was legally and entirely and without remainder her own. She had expected to feel something large when she read this. What she felt instead was small and specific, the way a real feeling usually was, a loosening in her shoulders, as though something she'd been bracing against had released its pressure. She finished her coffee. She worked her shift. She called Carmen to say thank you, and Carmen said you're welcome, and charged the final invoice to her card. The package arrived that afternoon at the studio, with no return address and international postage, and her name written in handwriting she knew. Inside was a single architectural sketch, the adobe building on Highland Avenue, fully realized, rendered in pencil with the precision of someone who understood the building's structure intimately, and had chosen to represent it not at its most impressive angle but at its most honest one, the north face, which caught the light poorly and was the side that required the most careful work to get right. The proportions were exact. The restored windows were shown with their proper dimensions. In the lower right corner, in the same handwriting as the address label, a single annotation. In case you ever want to own something that was rebuilt honestly. No name, no address. No ask inside the gesture, not a letter that required an answer, not a question that needed a response, not an opening gambit in a new round of strategic positioning. Just the sketch, just the building, just the handwriting of a man who had understood that the only thing he could offer without compromise was something that asked for nothing in return. Soledad held the sketch for a long time, longer than she held most things. She thought about what it would mean to forgive someone who had not asked to be forgiven. She thought about the difference between forgiveness and permission, about how often she had seen men confuse the two, treating the receipt of forgiveness as a license to continue. She thought about whether this sketch was that, a quiet request dressed as an offering, and she turned it over in her mind with the same precision she applied to everything, and concluded, no, it was not a request. It was the closest thing to an apology that a man of Sr.ElenaVoss's particular formation could, not verbal, not institutional, not framed as a solution, just, here is something honest, do with it what you want. She set the sketch on the windowsill. It faced the south window, toward the desert and the sky. She did not reach for her phone. She did not throw the sketch away. What she felt, standing at the window in the September afternoon, something she would not have had a word for, when she'd been standing at a gate with a canvas, duffel bag, and a father's neutral face, and the weight of an erasure she didn't yet understand. It was not happiness, exactly. And it was not resolution. The charter was void, but the history that produced it was not. Her father was still her father. Her mother was still choosing her silence. And Sr.ElenaVoss was somewhere in Europe drawing buildings and carrying the knowledge of what he'd done. None of that was resolved. The lights at the horizon were not resolved. The desert kept no record of what happened inside it and would not be called as a witness to anything. But she was here. She was in a building. She combed her hands, smelled of clay, and her name was in the window of the studio, and she had walked into the vastness of West Texas with nothing but a canvas duffel bag, and she had built something, not what she'd lost, not what she'd been promised, not the version of a life that someone else had arranged for her. Something of her own, with foundations she had dug herself, load-bearing walls she had chosen herself, and the knowledge, clean and specific and entirely hers, that she knew exactly what was holding. She went back to the wheel. Outside, the wind moved through Marfa the way it always had, tasting of dust and distance, and the particular loneliness of people who almost found each other, and the particular strength of people who found themselves instead. In the east, as the sun lowered behind the distant mountains and the sky went the deep blue of early evening, the lights appeared at the horizon, pale, sourceless, steady. No one had ever fully explained them. They were there regardless, moving through the dark, witnessed and real, and entirely uncommitted to anyone's interpretation of what they meant.